They removed me without a word. That's when everything broke. Section 1. The night everyone stopped asking my opinion. The humidity in the Oak Ridge Community Hall was thick, smelling of damp wool and overpriced catering. I sat in my usual chair, the third one from the left in the front row. For 7 years, this seat had been an unspoken anchor. People would lean over, whispering questions about zoning laws or the upcoming charity gala. I was Daniel Foster. I was the man with the answers. But that evening, the air felt different. It was cold, despite the late June heat. Megan Holloway stood at the podium, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the wood. She didn't look at me. Normally, she'd catch my eye for a nod of approval before starting. Today, her gaze skipped over my head, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved. I felt a slight prickle at the back of my neck. It was subtle. It was polite. That was the most dangerous part. In a town like ours, you aren't attacked with fire, you are erased with a smile. "We've decided to move the fundraiser to the harbor," Megan announced. Her voice was steady, bright, and entirely final. I felt a few eyes drift toward me, then quickly snap away. They were checking for a reaction. I gave them nothing. I kept my hands folded. I kept my expression neutral. Usually, I was the one who managed the logistics for the harbor events. I knew the permits were backed up for months. I knew the tides would be high that week. I knew the plan was a disaster in the making. I waited for the pause, the moment where someone, anyone, would ask, "Daniel, what do you think?" The silence stretched. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, calculated one. Ethan Price, sitting to my right, shifted his chair an inch away. It was a microscopic movement, but in the language of social standing, it was a mile. I realized then that a conversation had happened without me. A narrative had been built in the dark, and I was just now seeing the walls. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far the floor had dropped. If I spoke now, I would be the difficult one. I would be the man desperately clutching at his waning influence. I watched Thomas Holloway lean into his wife's ear, whispering something that made her smirk. They weren't looking at a colleague anymore. They were looking at a ghost. I felt the weight of my reputation, built over a decade, beginning to thin out like mist. The meeting ended without a single person approaching me to talk about the budget. Usually there was a line. Usually my hand was sore from shaking theirs. Tonight, the crowd divided like water around a stone. I stood up, smoothing my coat. Laura Bennett, a neighbor I'd helped with a legal dispute 3 years ago, caught my eye. She looked pained. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she just offered a tight, thin-lipped smile and hurried toward the exit. I walked to my car in the gravel lot. The crunch of the stones felt louder than usual. I wondered what the lie was. Was it a financial rumor? A personal failing? It didn't matter yet. The what is always secondary to the how, and the how was a masterclass in social engineering. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling. I looked at the community center in the rearview mirror. I realized that my value had been reassessed by people who didn't understand the cost of what I did. I understood that tonight was a test of my ego. Most men would have demanded an explanation. They would have called Megan or Ethan the moment they got home. They would have tried to defend a shadow they couldn't see. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I would do the opposite. I would become the person they thought I was, irrelevant. I would step back so completely that they would eventually have to face the void I left behind. As I drove home through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge, I saw Richard Collins's car parked outside the diner. He was talking to Ethan. They didn't see me. I saw the way Richard was gesturing wide, sweeping motions of his hands, as if he were explaining a grand new vision. Richard was the city liaison, a man who followed the scent of power like a hound. If he was with Ethan, the transition was already underway. I parked in my driveway. The lights in the house were warm, and Claire was probably waiting with tea. She didn't know yet. She didn't know that our social standing had shifted 5 degrees to the left while she was reading her book. I sat there for a long time, watching a moth beat itself against the porch light. It was desperate to get inside, to be part of the glow. I turned off the headlights and sat in the dark. That was the moment I understood that the only way to win this game was to stop playing it. Section 2. Politeness is where judgments hide. The following Sunday at the farmer's market, the exclusion became a tangible thing. It was in the way conversations would plateau when I approached. It was in the, "Oh, Daniel, we didn't think you'd be coming today," from people who knew I never missed a Sunday. The words were always kind, but the intent was sharp. It was the Midwest nice, turned into a weapon. I noticed that my name had been removed from the volunteer sign-up sheet for the park cleanup sheet for the park cleanup. "There must have been a clerical error," the young girl at the booth said, her face flushing a deep, guilty red. She wouldn't look me in the eye. She knew it wasn't an error. She had been told to leave me off. I didn't correct her. I didn't ask her to write my name back in. I simply nodded, thanked her for her time, and bought a bag of apples I didn't need. I could feel the eyes of the community on my back, watching to see if I'd snap. I stayed silent because any defense is a confession of weakness. If I fought for my spot on a volunteer list, I was admitting that their exclusion hurt me. I walked through the market with my head held high, acknowledging everyone with the same measured politeness I'd used for years. I saw Megan Holloway across the square, holding a clipboard like a scepter. She was surrounded by a small clique of the new leadership. They were laughing. I realized that they were enjoying my presence more than my absence. They wanted to see the fallen man wander through the ruins of his social life. It gave them a sense of collective righteousness. I was the problem they had quietly solved. What that problem actually was remained a mystery to me, but the consensus was already formed. In a small town, a consensus is more powerful than the truth. It becomes the truth. I spent the afternoon in my garden. The soil was honest. It didn't whisper behind my back. As I worked, I thought about the infrastructure of the town. I had spent years quietly fixing things that no one noticed. I knew which pipes in the community center were prone to freezing. I knew which donors only gave money if they got a handwritten note by the 15th of the month. I knew the delicate ego of the city council members. I had been the grease in the gears. Claire came out with 2 glasses of iced tea. She sat on the stone wall watching me dig. "The Andersons canceled dinner for Friday," she said softly. Her voice didn't hold anger, just a quiet, puzzled sadness. "They said Mark has a flu, but I saw them posting photos from the theater an hour ago." I stopped digging but didn't look up. The social quarantine had reached my wife. That was the first time I felt a flicker of genuine heat in my chest. "Let them," I said. My voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the vibration in my heart. "Don't call them, Claire. Don't ask for a better excuse." She sighed, a small, weary sound. She understood the rules of the game we were in. You don't chase people who are running away from you. You let them run until they tire themselves out. But the pressure was building. It wasn't just about missing a dinner. It was the slow stripping away of our belonging. By Monday, the silence from my phone was deafening. Usually, it rang every 20 minutes with someone asking for a favor or a piece of advice. Now, it was a paperweight. I went into my office and looked at the files for the upcoming town centennial. I was the chairman, or at least I had been. I hadn't received an email about the planning session in 3 days. I checked the public calendar on the town's website. The meeting was happening right now. I sat at my desk and did nothing. I didn't storm down to the town hall. I didn't send a scathing email about bylaws and procedures. I simply closed the laptop. The psychological pressure of being ignored is far greater than the pressure of being attacked. An attack gives you something to push against. Being ignored leaves you grasping at shadows. They were waiting for me to break, to show up uninvited and prove I was unstable or difficult. I stayed home and read a book on the porch. I made sure I was visible to anyone driving by. I looked relaxed. I looked like a man who had finally found some much-needed peace. But inside, I was observing the shifts. I saw Ethan Price's truck drive past my house 3 times that afternoon. He was checking on me. He wanted to see if I was brooding. He wanted to see the defeat. He didn't see it. He only saw a man enjoying his afternoon. That evening, a heavy rain began to fall. I looked out the window toward the community center down the hill. I knew that the drainage system in the back lot was clogged with debris from the spring. I had intended to clear it last week, but I had been forgotten from the maintenance schedule. I knew that within 2 hours, the basement of the center where they stored the historical archives would begin to take on water. I sat in my armchair and picked up my book. I could have made one phone call. I could have told Richard Collins to send a crew to the back lot. I could have saved the town's history from a muddy grave. But I realized that for the system to correct itself, it first had to fail. They had decided I wasn't needed. It was time for them to learn exactly what not needed looked like. I turned the page, the sound of the rain masking the quiet realization that the first cracks were about to appear. Session 3. I realized the story was moving without me. The morning after the storm, the air in Oak Ridge felt scrubbed clean, but the atmosphere at the local bakery was thick with a different kind of tension. I walked in at 7:30 a.m., my usual time. The bell above the door chimed, a lonely sound that seemed to vibrate longer than it should. Richard Collins and Ethan Price were huddled over a corner table, their voices low and urgent. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. It was a clumsy silence, the kind people use when they've been caught discussing someone's funeral while they're still in the room. I didn't avoid them. I walked straight to the counter, ordered a black coffee and 2 muffins, and nodded in their direction. Ethan looked away, suddenly fascinated by the crumb of his croissant. Richard, ever the politician, offered a forced plastic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Big rain last night, Daniel," he called out, his voice a pitch too high. I simply tilted my head in acknowledgement. I didn't mention the community center basement. I didn't ask if the archives were dry. As I waited for my order, I overheard a snippet from the table behind me. 2 women from the garden club were whispering about a mismanagement of funds and unaccounted hours. They didn't say my name, but they didn't have to. The way they glanced at my back before looking at their plates told the whole story. The lie had finally taken a shape. It was the oldest trick in the book, imply a financial shadow. It's a stain that never truly washes out, even if you prove your innocence. I realized then that the narrative had moved into a phase where facts no longer mattered. They weren't looking for the truth, they were looking for a reason to justify their previous coldness. If I had stolen, then their exclusion of me wasn't cruelty, it was justice. I felt the weight of their collective judgment pressing against my shoulders, but I refused to slouch. I stayed silent because to defend myself against a rumor I wasn't supposed to know about would be an admission that it had reached me. It would show that I was listening at doors. I took my coffee and walked out, leaving the heavy silence behind me. On the drive home, I passed the community center. 3 city maintenance trucks were parked in the lot, and men were hauling soggy cardboard boxes out of the service entrance. The historical archives. A century of Oak Ridge history, now a pulp of gray paper and ink. My heart twinged for the loss of the documents, but my mind remained cold. I had been the only one who checked those drains. I was the only one who remembered the 1994 flood. When I got home, I found a letter in the mailbox. No stamp. It had been hand-delivered. It was a formal notification from the Board of Trustees, signed by Megan Holloway. It stated that due to a restructuring of community oversight, my services as a volunteer consultant were no longer required. It was written in the most sterile, polite language imaginable. It thanked me for my past contributions while subtly suggesting that those contributions were now a liability. It was a pink slip for a job I did for free. I took the letter to my backyard and burned it in the fire pit. I watched the edges curl and blacken, the polite words disappearing into smoke. I didn't feel angry. I felt a strange, liberating sense of emptiness. The social contract I had signed with this town had been torn up by them, not me. I was now a free agent in a space that used to be my life. I realized that the more they pushed me out, the more they were forced to take on the burdens I had quietly carried for a decade. By that afternoon, the first cracks in their new, efficient structure began to show. My phone, which had been silent, buzzed with a text from a junior staffer at the city hall. "Mr. Foster, do you have the master key code for the annex? We can't find it in the files, and the contractor is waiting." I looked at the message. I knew the code. I had memorized it years ago. I also knew it wasn't in the files because I had been told to keep it off record for security reasons by the very board that just fired me. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down on the counter. It wasn't about spite, it was about boundaries. If I was no longer a consultant, I no longer provided consultations. I stayed silent because silence is the only thing that forces people to realize the value of what you used to say. I went back to my gardening, focusing on the precision of the shears against the hedge. I was building a wall, one quiet hour at a time. As the sun began to set, I saw a familiar car pull into the cul-de-sac. It was Laura Bennett. She didn't get out. She just sat there for a few minutes looking at my house. She looked like someone standing on the edge of a cold lake, wondering if she should jump in. Eventually, she drove away. I realized that the community was starting to feel the chill. They had removed the man who kept the lights on, and now they were beginning to realize how dark it was getting. That was the moment I understood that the story wasn't about my fall, it was about their education. Section 4. Silence creates its own evidence. A week passed, and the social quarantine of Daniel Foster became a localized law. When I went to the post office, people suddenly found the posters on the walls very interesting. When I entered the hardware store, the conversation at the counter would disperse like smoke in a breeze. I had become a walking ghost, a reminder of a scandal that no one could quite name, but everyone agreed was real. The psychological pressure was immense, a constant low-frequency hum of rejection that followed me everywhere. I noticed that Ethan Price had taken over my role as the liaison for the new library wing. I saw him in the town square, wearing a hard hat that looked too clean, pointing at blueprints he clearly didn't understand. He was surrounded by the same people who used to surround me. He looked stressed. His face was a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was skyrocketing. He was finding out that status came with a lot of invisible work, and Ethan was a man who preferred the title to the task. I stayed silent because I knew that every mistake he made was a brick in the wall of my eventual return. I didn't offer help. I didn't point out that the soil samples for the library site hadn't been cleared for the heavy machinery he was bringing in. I simply watched from the sidewalk, a bag of groceries in my hand, like any other uninvolved citizen. I was becoming a master of the blank stare. When people looked at me, searching for a sign of bitterness, they found nothing but a calm, polite void. The rumors had escalated. Now, people were saying I had been asked to leave the charity board because of irregularities. It was a beautiful, vague word. It could mean anything. It was a vacuum that everyone filled with their own worst fears. I realized that by not defending myself, I was letting their own imaginations do the work. Silence creates its own evidence. Because I didn't scream, they assumed I was guilty. But because I didn't scream, they also couldn't find a handle to grab onto to pull me down further. One evening, Richard Collins came to my door. It was the first time anyone from the inner circle had visited since the night at the community hall. He looked tired. There were bags under his eyes, and his tie was crooked. He didn't wait for me to invite him in. He just stood on the porch, shifting his weight from side to side. "Daniel," he started, his voice lacking its usual theatrical boom, "we're having some trouble with the centennial permits. The state office says the applications are incomplete." I leaned against the doorframe, my expression unreadable. I knew exactly what was wrong with the permits. I had purposefully left them in a state of pending before the board restructured me, knowing that only I understood the specific state codes required to finalize them. It wasn't sabotage, it was simply a task I hadn't finished before I was told to stop working. "I'm sure the new committee can handle it, Richard," I said softly. My voice was as smooth as river stone. Richard let out a frustrated huff. "Ethan says you're withholding the files." There it was, the shift from exclusion to accusation. They were failing, so they needed a villain. If the permits didn't go through, it wouldn't be Ethan's incompetence, it would be Daniel's malice. I didn't blink. I didn't get angry. I stayed silent for 5 long seconds, letting the accusation hang in the humid evening air until it felt heavy and ridiculous. "The files are in the cabinet in the clerk's office, where they've always been," I said calmly. "If Ethan can't find them, perhaps he should look closer. Or perhaps he should ask the clerk." I knew the clerk was out on maternity leave and the temporary replacement didn't know the filing system. I wasn't being difficult, I was being precise. Richard looked at me, and for a second I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He realized that I wasn't going to make this easy for him. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. I stayed silent because I wanted him to feel the vacuum. I wanted him to realize that my authority wasn't a gift given by the board. It was a result of my competence. And competence cannot be transferred by a vote or a letter of dismissal. He opened his mouth to say something else, likely an appeal to my sense of community, but I slowly began to close the door. "Good night, Richard. I hope the festival is a success," I said, and clicked the lock. That night, I sat in the dark in my living room. I realized that the power balance had shifted. Before, they had the power to ignore me. Now, I had the power to watch them struggle. The psychological pressure was moving from me to them. They were the ones with the deadlines. They were the ones with the public expectations. I was just a man in a quiet house watching the rain. I felt a sense of quiet dominance. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't made a threat, and yet the entire town leadership was currently losing sleep because I was simply sitting still. Section 5. The First Apology. I never acknowledged. The grocery store on a Tuesday morning is usually a sanctuary of mundane routines, but for me, it had become a gauntlet of forced eye contact and sudden aisle changes. I was reaching for a carton of eggs when I felt a presence beside me. It was Thomas Holloway. He didn't have his usual swagger. His shoulders were slumped, and he was staring at the dairy shelf with a look of profound exhaustion. Thomas was the kind of man who viewed social status as a blood sport, yet here he was, looking like he'd lost a long-distance race. "Daniel," he muttered, his voice barely rising above the hum of the refrigerators. I wanted to say that things have been a bit chaotic at the hall." I didn't turn my head. I kept my focus on the expiration date of the eggs. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the empty aisle. "Megan is under a lot of pressure. The library project hit a snag with the foundation, and the city is asking for the environmental impact reports you used to manage. We might have overstepped with that letter." I stayed silent because an apology offered in the privacy of a grocery store is not an apology. It is a plea for a favor. He wasn't sorry for the character assassination or the whispered lies about my integrity. He was sorry that the world was harder to navigate without my expertise. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. To acknowledge his words would be to accept a bargain where I gave him my knowledge in exchange for his temporary kindness. I wasn't interested in that trade. I finally turned to him, but I didn't offer a smile. I gave him the polite, distant look one gives a stranger who has asked for the time. "I'm sure the new engineers will find the reports, Thomas. I left everything in the primary database before my access was revoked." The word "revoked" hung in the air like a physical weight. I saw him flinch. He knew, and I knew, that the database had been wiped by Ethan in a fit of organizational cleanup, and the only copies left were on an encrypted drive in my home office. I realized that this was the moment the tide began to turn. The first crack in their collective front had appeared. Thomas was the scout, sent to see if I was still pliable, if I was still the man who would sacrifice his dignity for the greater good of Oak Ridge. When I didn't bite, his face shifted from forced regret to a flicker of genuine panic. He realized that the nice guy he had helped push out wasn't coming back to save them. I placed the eggs in my cart and walked away without another word. I stayed silent as I checked out, even as the cashier, a woman named Sarah who had ignored me for 3 weeks, suddenly tried to make small talk about the weather. I didn't indulge her. I wasn't mean, but I was formal. I was the person they had made me, an outsider. The psychological pressure of my silence was now working in reverse. They wanted me to be Daniel again so they could feel better about what they'd done. By remaining the ghost of Daniel, I was forcing them to live with the consequences of their choices. As I loaded the groceries into my car, Ethan Price pulled into the spot across from me. He didn't get out. He just watched me. I could see the anger radiating from his posture even through the windshield. He was the one who had to explain to the mayor why the library project was 2 months behind and why the historical documents were rotting in a dumpster. He wanted me to be the villain so badly, yet I was just a man putting milk in his trunk. I sat in my car and watched him in the rearview mirror. I realized that the moral victory wasn't going to be a grand speech at a town hall. It was going to be this, the slow, agonizing realization by my peers that they had destroyed their own support system out of petty jealousy. I felt a sense of restrained power. I had the answers they needed, but more importantly, I had the patience to keep them. I started the engine and drove out of the lot, leaving Ethan sitting in his idling truck, trapped in a mess of his own making. Section 6. People begin to adjust around absence. Absence is not a whole, it is a shape. By the second month of my exclusion, the shape of my absence was becoming impossible for the town to ignore. The 4th of July committee had failed to secure the fireworks permit on time, leading to a lackluster display that left the townspeople grumbling. The annual Founders' Day parade had been redirected onto a street that was under construction, resulting in a 3-hour traffic jam. These were small things individually, but collectively, they were a mounting evidence of institutional decay. I spent my mornings at the local library, not the one Ethan was failing to build, but the old, cramped one on Elm Street. I sat in the back, reading journals on urban planning and local history. I noticed that people had stopped looking away when I entered. Now, they looked at me with a sort of quiet, desperate curiosity. It was as if they were waiting for me to stand up and fix everything. I saw Laura Bennett there one afternoon. She sat at the table across from mine, pretending to read a magazine, but her eyes were constantly drifting to me. "The basement at the community center smells like mold now," she said suddenly, her voice trembling slightly. It was a breach of the social protocol that had been established. I didn't look up from my book. I simply turned the page. "They say a lot of the old photos are gone forever. Richard is blaming the rain, but everyone knows the drains were blocked." I stayed silent because I wanted her to feel the weight of her own complicity. She had been in that room when they ignored me. She had offered that thin, cowardly smile. I realized that the community was beginning to eat its own. Without me to serve as the silent coordinator, the remaining leaders were turning on one another. Rumors were now circulating about Ethan's incompetence and Megan's authoritarian style. The narrative they had built about me was being overwritten by the reality of their own failure. It was a slow burn correction. I didn't have to say a word. I just had to exist in my own dignified space and let the system crumble. I stayed silent because the moment I offered a critique, I would become part of the noise. By saying nothing, I remained the standard against which their failure was measured. I was the before to their after. I felt the psychological pressure shifting into a state of quiet dominance. I was no longer the man being humiliated. I was the man being mourned. People were starting to miss the version of Oak Ridge that functioned correctly, and they were beginning to remember who had made it function. One evening, a group of neighbors, people who hadn't spoken to me in weeks, showed up at my house with a tray of cookies and a friendly check-in. They stood on my porch, looking hopeful and slightly ashamed. They talked about the misunderstandings and how the town just isn't the same. They were looking for a way to bridge the gap without having to admit they were wrong. They wanted me to invite them in, to laugh, and to tell them it was all okay. I didn't invite them in. I stood at the door, thanked them for the cookies, and remained perfectly polite. "It's kind of you to stop by," I said, my voice neutral. "I've been enjoying the quiet time. It's given me a chance to focus on my own projects." I saw the disappointment on their faces. They realized that the bridge was gone. I wasn't angry, which was worse for them. Anger can be negotiated. A calm, polite distance is a wall that has no door. I realized that they weren't there because they missed me. They were there because they were uncomfortable with the atmosphere they had created. They wanted me to absolve them so they could go back to their lives without the guilt of having treated a good man like a pariah. I closed the door softly, the sound of their retreating footsteps on the gravel satisfyingly heavy. They were learning that reputation is easy to break but nearly impossible to mend once the owner has moved on. That night I received a phone call from Richard Collins. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, his voice sounding thin and broken. "Daniel, we're in a real spot with the budget. There's an audit coming from the state, and, well, Ethan can't find the ledger for the 2023 grants. We need you to come in, just for an hour, to help us find the trail." I deleted the message. I stayed silent because the ledger wasn't lost. It was exactly where I had left it, documented and filed under a system they had chosen to ignore. I sat on my porch, watching the fireflies in the yard. I felt a profound sense of peace. The world was demanding my return, but I was no longer the man who lived for their approval. I had found a quiet power in being the one who wasn't there. The story was no longer about my exclusion. It was about their inability to survive without the very person they had deemed irrelevant. I understood then that the greatest moral victory isn't being proven right. It's being proven essential after you've already let go. Section 7. Respect returns without explanation. The transition from pariah to pillar happened not with a bang, but with a series of small, desperate surrenders. It was a Tuesday evening, the air thick with the scent of mown grass and the looming humidity of an Oak Ridge summer. I was sitting on my front porch, a glass of water in hand, when I saw Megan Holloway's car pull up to the curb. She didn't get out immediately. She sat there, her hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, staring at my house as if it were a fortress she didn't know how to storm. When she finally stepped onto the pavement, her movements were stiff, stripped of the performative grace she usually carried. "Daniel," she said, stopping at the bottom of my porch steps. She didn't wait for an invitation this time. "The state auditor is coming on Friday. The Library Foundation has been flagged for a structural discrepancy, and Ethan has resigned." I didn't move. I didn't offer a chair. I stayed silent because the news of Ethan's resignation wasn't a shock. It was an inevitability. A man who builds his house on someone else's stolen blueprints will always see it collapse. I watched her eyes flicker, searching for a spark of triumph in mine. She found nothing. I was as still as the trees behind me. I realized that she wasn't here to apologize, even now. She was here because the system she had tried to lead was about to expose her. "We need the original survey maps," she continued, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "The ones you commissioned 3 years ago. They aren't in the digital archives. Richard says you might have kept hard copies." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. I saw the fraying at the edges of her composure. She was realizing that the power she had seized was actually a massive, crushing weight of responsibility that she was entirely unprepared to carry. I stayed silent because I wanted her to sit in the quiet. I wanted her to feel the vacuum where my support used to be. In the past, I would have stood up, walked to my office, and handed her the maps within 30 seconds. I would have reassured her. I would have saved her. But that Daniel Foster had been discarded by a committee vote. The man sitting on the porch was a stranger to her. The maps were filed with the county clerk's office as per the 2021 mandate, I said finally, my voice low and steady. "If they are missing, it is a matter for the county, not for me." The psychological pressure was now a physical presence between us. She knew the county clerk's office was a labyrinth of bureaucracy that would take weeks to navigate, time she didn't have. She looked like she wanted to scream, to accuse me of obstruction, but she couldn't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply followed the very rules they had used to exclude me. I had become a master of malicious compliance through total inaction. I realized then that respect was returning to me, but it was a cold, sharp kind of respect, the kind people have for a storm they can't control. As she walked back to her car, her head bowed, I saw several neighbors watching from their windows. They weren't whispering anymore. They were observing a shift in the hierarchy. The queen of the community had come to the exile to beg, and she had left empty-handed. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound sense of relief. The truth was finally outrunning the lies. I didn't need to defend my reputation because the sheer incompetence of my replacements was doing the job for me. I went inside and closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like a period at the end of a very long, difficult sentence. Section 8. What remains when the narrative collapses? The final meeting of the season was held in the same hall where the betrayal had begun, but the atmosphere had shifted from a courtroom to a wake. I didn't sit in the front row this time. I sat in the back, near the door, a casual observer of a world I no longer felt the need to anchor. Megan Holloway was not at the podium. Richard Collins was, and he looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single month. The room was packed, but the air was quiet. There was no whispering, no smug glances, no social maneuvering. There was only the stark, cold reality of a budget deficit and a half-finished library. Richard cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He didn't look away this time. "We've had a difficult quarter," he began, his voice lacking its usual resonance. "There were errors in judgment, miscommunications regarding the leadership of our core projects. As a result, the board has voted to dissolve the current oversight committee." A collective breath seemed to leave the room. He paused, looking down at his notes. We would like to formally invite Daniel Foster to return as the senior advisor to the board with full autonomy over the Centennial and library projects. I stayed silent because I wanted the invitation to hang in the air long enough for everyone to taste it. This was the moment of full revelation. The silence wasn't a trap anymore, it was a mirror. I watched the faces of the people who had avoided me at the market, the people who had burned my name off volunteer lists, the people who had believed the worst because it was easier than standing up for the truth. They were all looking at me now, waiting for a sign of forgiveness, waiting for me to take the burden off their shoulders so they could feel good. Again. I realized that I didn't want the role. Not because of spite, but because I had found something more valuable in my months of exile, my own autonomy. I stood up slowly. The entire room turned as one. I didn't walk to the podium. I stayed where I was, by the exit. "I appreciate the offer, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "But a community is built on trust, not just competence. When that trust is broken for the sake of convenience, the foundation is no longer safe to build upon. I will help the transition team for 30 days to ensure the records are in order. After that, I am retiring from public service." The shock in the room was palpable. They expected me to jump at the chance to have my status back. They didn't understand that I had outgrown the status. I had seen the underside of their politeness, and I no longer had a taste for it. I saw Laura Bennett wipe a tear from her eye. I saw Thomas Holloway look at the floor in genuine shame. The moral victory was complete. I hadn't destroyed them, I had simply allowed them to show me who they were, and then I had chosen to walk away from the wreckage. I stayed silent as I turned and walked out of the hall before the meeting was even adjourned. The cool night air of Oak Ridge hit my face, and for the first time in a year, I felt completely light. My reputation was intact, not because I had fought for it, but because I had outlasted the lies. I had maintained my dignity while they lost theirs. I understood that the same social system that had diminished me had been forced to admit its own failure. I had won by doing nothing, by saying nothing, and by being exactly who I was. As I walked to my car, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Richard. He looked desperate. "Daniel, wait! We can't do this without you. The town! What will people say?" I stopped and looked at him. I didn't feel anger. Only a quiet, distant pity. "They'll say whatever they want, Richard. They always do. But for the first time, I won't be listening." I got into my car and drove home. The narrative had collapsed, the truth had remained, and in the quiet of the night, I realized that silence wasn't just my weapon, it was my freedom. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.